Very warm welcome to the British Library. It's a fantastic morning outside, but so good to have so many of you in here. My name is Sam Blake, and I'm the author of The Killing Sense, amongst a few other books, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here today. We have the most amazing lineup. I say Bee Rowlatt is the kingpin behind this, the queen pin behind this day, and it's just a fantastic opportunity to get the deadly women together. I think you're going to enjoy it. We've got some incredible sessions, which we don't want you to miss. And in between each session, there's going to be about half an hour where you'll be able to go outside and get books and get them signed, very important, and also obviously pick up refreshments and other bits and pieces. Now, just so that you all know, the fire exits are, there's one here just at the front of the building, there's one at the front of the room, sorry, one right at the back at the top there. With one over here? One over here too, can't see the sign there. I'm checking this. I know this is a situation, you know, it's a bit like being the flight attendant thing, where you go, fire exits, and everybody goes, it's fine, there won't be fire situation at all. But I actually ran an event recently where there was one. So if there is one today, I can guarantee I'll never be asked back to the British Library ever again. So hopefully nothing will happen. But anyway, you know where to go. So the staff are amazing and they will help you out of the building. Obviously, don't use the lift. So today is a celebration of the brilliant women writing all kinds of crime. And we want you to absolutely get ready for a feast of criminal delights. We want you to get your questions ready because there's questions time after every session. And in this first session, we are going to be exploring the politics of crime. And you are in the very, very capable hands of Ayesha Hazarika. Ayesha is an acclaimed broadcaster, comedian and writer, and known for her informed observations on current affairs and politics. And when she's not being a baroness in the House of Lords, she's also a host on Times Radio and a TV regular, and co-host of the podcast Take On Tomorrow. So we're absolutely thrilled that she could squeeze us in for this event, to open, really, this event on Saturday morning. I think a quick round of applause there is definitely needed. So thank you very much indeed, Ayesha, for coming. Now, if I can invite the ladies to the stage, we can get going. There we go. And let them get themselves settled. As I say, books are outside. I'm sure you saw the bookshop as you were coming in.
Wonderful. Well, Sam, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here, and it's so lovely to see so many of you here bright and early. And before we start, can we just take a moment to just appreciate the set? I mean, this is the best looking stage I have ever been on. It's like something from a film set. I mean, it really is. I just want to have, but someone has got to lounge on that before the day is over and say, paint me like one of your French girls. Someone absolutely has to do that. Well, look, it's such an honour for me to be here this morning, to be in your company, and to get the chance to have a chat with these three incredibly talented women who have all just produced such brilliant, brilliant work. I've been busy reading all of their books, and absolutely fantastic. You know, every one of them is so different. There's so much thought and research that's going into them. But there are some common themes that we're going to sort of pick out as well, which of course is germane to what we're going to be discussing today. And I suppose just to take a step back to give us a bit of an overview of some of the themes we're going to be exploring today. It's a brilliant festival that Bee has... And let's have a round of applause for Bee, who's done so much hard work. Because she's already incredibly busy doing all her other things. And look at that fabulous jacket as well. It's like, it's a bit Ziggy Star. We're loving, or absolutely loving it. But I'm so interested in the themes we're discussing today because as part of my journalism, my radio show, I have a culture hour, so I'm very, very interested in literature and particularly women's writing. But also I cover the news, and crime is, of course, the issue which... And we're going to discuss this with Kate in terms of your historical look back through crime. We're all fascinated by crime, whether we want to admit it or not. Sometimes we're a bit snobby about admitting it. Whether we consume it as news, it's a terrible thing to say, but sort of, you know, crime sells newspapers and gets clicks on social media these days. it's such an important part of the dramatic narrative, whether we're talking about film, television, books. But even though there are more women writing about crime, such as the three brilliant women we're going to talk to today and throughout the day, crime, the way we report it in the first draft of history in terms of journalism, in terms of how we see it from a dramatic point of view, it's still seen through quite a male lens. You know, lots of the discussions we're having about violence against women and girls, which is incredibly important. One thing I do always think about is how do we treat the stories about crime, whether against women, whether they're, you know, things that have happened which are real, or whether they're things which are fictitious. You know, is there too much voyeurism? Do we kind of tell these stories in a way which is actually comfortable? Not that these stories are ever going to be super comfortable for women. So I'm just really interested in getting into some of that with our panellists today, and I'm sure there are themes that will be picked up throughout the rest of the day as well. And also, you know, I don't want to be snobby about the fact that we all are really kind of drawn to crime and sort of seduced to crime. There's nothing kind of ignoble about that, because telling a story through crime is often a way of telling a story not just about that incident, but about wider society, about values of the day, about morality of the day, about who we value, how the criminal justice system works. So it's a way into often much more interesting and complicated and bigger stories about our society. So we've got lots of interesting themes to pick through today, but let me introduce our panel to you. It's absolutely brilliant to have Kate Summerscale here, who is a brilliant, brilliant author. She is the author of the best-selling Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, which was the winner of the Samuel Johnson Prize for non-fiction and has won major things. It was adapted into an ITV work. And she's here today to talk about her new work, which is called The Peepshow, which is now on the long list for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction 2025. I think that deserves a round of applause, which is a great accolade. And Kate has really gone back, very much the themes that I've just been talking now, has gone back through history and painstakingly put together not just the story of the individuals, but the story of society at the time of these horrific murders that happened back in 1953 around 10 Rillington Place. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation with Kate about that. Kia Abdullah is a best-selling author and travel writer. She's been longlisted for the CWA Gold Dagger Awards, and she won the Adult Fiction Diverse Book Award and a J.B. Priestley Award for Writers of Promise. She's a hugely accomplished writer, and her new book, she has got a new book coming out later this year, but the book we're going to be talking about today is absolutely fascinating, and it's a book that really, really spoke to me, particularly as a woman of colour. It's called Those People Next Door, and the premise is you can choose your house, and we all have a little sneaky peek on Rightmove most weeks, I suppose, but you can't choose your neighbours, and it's a fascinating book that looks at the concept of love thy neighbour, but also really interesting, often difficult conversations about class, but also race and culture clash. So it's brilliant to have. Let's have a warm round of applause. Thank you. And then, of course, we have the wonderful Bee Rowlatt here, and we're discussing Bee's first foray into fiction, which is a brilliant, brilliant book. I can already see a mini-series or a film around it called One Woman Crime Wave, and it's been described by Liz Nugent as a fantastic novel about fractured families, class, and the politics of parenting. Beautifully written and very moving. It tells the story of Ashley, who is a 15-year-old babysitter, who looks on the surface of it as like your kind of dream babysitter, but what lurks beneath it is quite dark and very interesting, and it is brilliant. It's really sharp, it's really funny, it's very moving, great central female character. So let's have a big warm round of applause for So, Kate, I'm going to start with you. Just for our audience who may not be familiar with the story of what happened at 10 Rillington Place, just give them a bit of an introduction into that story.
Yes, there are two strands to it, really. It was in March 1953, a discovery was made at 10 Rillington Place, this very dilapidated house in Notting Hill, of the bodies of 3 women hidden behind a kitchen wall. Then the body of another woman was found under the floorboards, and the bones of 2 further victims in the garden. And a manhunt was launched for the tenant of the ground floor flat, a middle-aged, apparently respectable man called Reg Christie. But it also became apparent on that day, as the police began to search for Christie, that there might have been a very disturbing miscarriage of justice associated with this same house, because at the address, 3 years earlier, the bodies of a woman and her child had been discovered in the wash house in the back garden. And the woman's husband, a man called Tim Evans, had been arrested, charged and hanged for the crime. He confessed to it, but on another occasion he said that Christie had done it. The jury didn't believe him. But now that Christie was being hunted as a serial killer who had not only strangled to death but gassed and raped his victims, it became possible that Tim Evans had been innocent after all, and that the British courts had seen a terrible miscarriage of justice. So the story had this sensational, lurid, ghoulish appeal to the British public, who were absolutely gripped by it, and the tabloid press went crazy for it. But there was also these implications for the justice system and the government that were very troubling and gave it a sort of political dimension.
And what's so fascinating about this case, but also your book, is it very much touched on some of the themes I introduced at the beginning of the discussion, which is such a good example of our sort of obsession with lurid stories. And it very much paints the picture of, you know, a Sunday afternoon activity for a genteel English gentleman is sort of a night, you know, you might have your Sunday lunch, sit down with a cup of tea, open the news of the world and read about murder, basically. But when you were looking back at that sort of time, the thing that's really interesting about what you've done with your book, and there is a film about this and there's quite a lot that's been written, but it's very much about these 2 men. Your book shines a light really on society at that time, because we're in post-war England. There's lots of changes happening in society with Windrush. There's lots of kind of immigration in that sort of area. Just paint a picture of what you pieced together about what you learned about society at that time.
Yes, it seemed, especially Notting Hill, was a real kind of the light that this case, the investigation shed on this little bit of West London, was also opened up all kinds of questions about race, because a lot of the West Indian immigrants who had been moving to Britain since the war were living in that area, often in very crowded circumstances, because it was so difficult and expensive circumstances, because it was so difficult for them to get accommodation at all. And the women who Christie killed were in many ways desperate, in different ways desperate. There was a culture of illegal abortion in the area, prostitution. So it was a really desolate, deprived society. Many of the buildings were still suffering from bomb damage. The rebuilding hadn't been continued. There was a massive housing shortage. Rationing was still in force. I was kind of startled to see that in 1953, the year of Elizabeth's coronation, the conditions were so bleak for many people in Britain. And I think that this case, as crime stories often do, sort of brought this to public attention and kind of confronted the wider public with these issues, as well as the individual horror of this one man who's had such sort of twisted intentions and contempt for his victims.
And how important was it for you to humanise the female victims in all of this, to sort of take them away from that kind of lurid tabloid sensationalism, and actually, you know, put flesh on their bones as human beings?
Yeah, I was fascinated to find there was much more about them in the archives, in the police files, the witness statements and so on. They never made it into the press or the courts, because in the press his victims, Christie's victims, were characterised as sort of poor little unfortunates, you know, kind of hopeless women whose lives had almost been bound to end in violence. They were also, in a sort of prurient way, their pictures were presented, and some of the tabloids commented on their scantily clad bodies, as if, which of course they were scantily clad because of what Christie had done to them, and their well-developed bodies, as if they were being paraded as objects of desire, even after their deaths. So it was really gripping to find out through the letters from families, testimony of their employers and friends and lovers, what their lives to date had been. And they ranged from a woman, a Jewish refugee from Austria who had wanted to be a nurse, and who had a child who was born in West Hampstead, to a woman who drank very heavily, sold sex for a living, had some great friendships with other women and men in West London, and who was sleeping in a public lavatory at the junction of the Harrow Road and Edgware Road at the time. So they had, you know, many of them were new in the city. Christie had targeted people who didn't have family and great networks of family and friends who might track them down. And it was amazing how, not easy, but the material was right there in the police files, you know, with which you could piece together their lives.
And how did you go about your research for pulling this book together?
Well, I've never written a book that there was so much material on. there were files on Timothy Evans, Metropolitan Police files. On Christie, there were Home Office files on both of them also. There were millions of words, and prison files, so you could track how they behaved and what their conditions were when they were incarcerated. And then there was the newspaper reports. This was an absolutely massive case. And there were the newspaper reports. I always love reading old newspapers, and they're so sort of rich and detailed. And they also reveal so much about the attitudes, the assumptions, the fears, the fantasies of the time. And there were 2 public inquiries which amassed, like, you know, tens of thousands of words as well. So often I research obscure stories. This time it was a matter of kind of charting a path through a mass of material.
Well, I cannot recommend Peepshow enough. It is such a brilliant book, and it's a real testament to your forensic investigation and inquisition and inquiry, because the general consensus is this is a story that has had a lot of attention, and yet you have managed to put together something which feels new and fresh, because you have told the stories of particularly the women and the other people who were just, you know, kind of pushed to the side. So well done, Kate. Let's give Kate a round of applause, because the book is absolutely
Can I just ask Kate about the title, Peepshow?
I love the title.
Yes.
You know, it distills a certain culture as well, doesn't it? So
well,
how did you come about?
Well, Christie was a voyeur. There are many comparisons could be made between him and someone like Dominique Pellicot, who drugged and raped his wife. He took photographs of, pornographic photographs of women. So it was an allusion to him, but it was also an allusion to crime as a peep show for us, the public, including, of course, my book, you know, and the way in which we get the ethics and the of gazing on these things and the tone, you know, how we do it and what we make of it, what we do with it.
Now, Kia, let's move on to your brilliant book, which is called Those People Next Door. And as I said in the introduction, I absolutely loved it, because I've never read a book like this. I've not seen anything actually in the dramatic narrative, because we know that there's often a lot of tension between neighbours, but what you have done is just captured. I think this is happening, not to the extent which happens in your book, but I think what you've captured brilliantly is the tension that exists between neighbours and the growing tensions, particularly as we're living in an ever more, I think it's never been particularly easy. I mean, just hearing back from what was happening in the early 1950s in London about racial tension with, you know, Windrush and all of that kind of thing. But now, you know, your book is set in modern times, and it's very much about culture clash and tension between neighbours. And I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It felt so real as well. So just, again, give our audience just a little glimpse into the story.
Of course, thank you. So Those People Next Door follows a London teacher called Salma, and she moves to a kind of safe suburban suburb of London in search of a better life for her family. And soon after arriving, she is invited to a neighbourhood barbecue, and there she meets her next door neighbour, Tom, who's a bit of an alpha male. He's friendly enough, but she just gets certain vibes of him. And the next day when she returns from work, she sees him knocking out the Black Lives Matter banner that her son put in a plant pot in their front yard. And initially she chooses not to say anything. She takes the banner inside and she puts it in her window instead. But the next morning she wakes up to find her window smeared with paint. And this time she does choose to confront him, and he denies it. But tensions between the two families escalate, and it becomes clear that somebody is going to get hurt. And I just wanted to examine kind of the ways in which we use slogans. You know, Black Lives Matter became a movement. And what was interesting for me is the family are Asian, and her own son actually convinces her to put the banner outside. She says, you know, we're new here. Why are you basically being provocative? And that's how she sees it. And he says, well, you know, do Black Lives only matter on social media? And she kind of makes that concession, and then obviously it creates tension, and then that's kind of used as a jumping off point for the novel. And the St. George's Cross also has a bit of a role in the novel. One of the anecdotes in the book actually came from my own life. So in the book, Salma recounts this story of when she was younger, and I remember this, I think it was the 1996 World Cup. I had drawn a St. George's Cross because obviously it's, you know, the England flag, put it in our living room window. And that evening when my dad came home, he ripped it down in a complete panic and said, don't ever do that again. And I said, why? You know, to me, it was an innocent symbol of supporting my local, you know, my national football team. And he said, we'll get a brick through our window. And so to him, it was what it was at the time, you know, an emblem of kind of fascism and used by people that he saw as a threat, whereas for me it was a symbol of national pride. And so growing up, I always had a very funny relationship with it because of that early experience. And so that kind of plays into the novel as well.
And I think what's so great about it is that it, you know, it starts small, doesn't it? Because at the barbecue, I suppose you might describe it, I don't know, as a microaggression, there's a sort of miscommunication where he says, oh, we didn't think people like you would kind of live here. And she thinks at the beginning he's saying, oh, because you're doing well for yourself. And it's only afterwards she realises he's meaning, oh, we thought people like you couldn't afford to live around here. So already, even from the first point that they meet, he's made assumption, you know, he's made an assumption about her. And even when she's going to the barbecue, she does feel a bit nervous about going to the barbecue. Just because I think that's so interesting, because I think a lot of people do feel like that anxiety about, is that how people are going to sort of see me? Because he already puts his, you know, he kind of gives, that's quite a reveal about how he sees them as an Asian family.
Yeah, and she's trying really hard to assimilate. Yeah. Before they go in, you know, she's fixing up her son, as you would do before you go in, and she's trying really hard. And, you know, some of the, I wouldn't say this particular example was a microaggression, but some of it was quite subtle. For example, at one point, his dog comes up to him and he says, oh, her name is Lola. And then he pauses and says, she was a showgirl. And Salma laughs. And you know, he relaxes because he thinks, oh, she's one of us. She recognises the lyric from the Barry Manilow song. And this actually happened to me. So in 2018, in 2018, I left London to move to the Yorkshire Dales. And initially, I was looking in a tiny village called Reeth, and it just sits in this beautiful caldera of hills, and it's gorgeous. And there was this stone cottage that I went to see, and the next door neighbour, who was this, you know, grumpy old man, came out and said, oh, where are you from? And I said, London. And he went, you know what I mean? and I said, oh, well, my family are originally from Bangladesh, but I was born and bred in London. And then his dog came up to him and he said, oh, her name is Lola. She was a showgirl. And I laughed, and you could just see him relax, because it was like, oh, you understand, you know, you're conversant with the culture of Britain. And I was like, yeah, I was born and bred in London. And so I used that example. And so there's just all these small examples. Like another example is Linda, the hostess of the barbecue, says, oh, you know, thank you for bringing potato salad. Oh, next time you can bring something with a bit more zing.
Yeah.
You know, and some people have called her racist, which personally I don't think that is racist. I think it's a bit of a bid for connection. But it's all these little subtleties that point out that you're other. And in the book, Salma and her husband kind of have a laugh about it, but some readers might kind of read that and think, well, you know, that's... I mean, some readers have called her racist, and I think that's a bit strong, but it's interrogating these little subtleties and where they sit in the hierarchy of what some people might say is racism.
And the other thing that I felt was really interesting about this is, you know, we do, well, I'd say up until quite recently, we quite prided ourselves on being quite a, you know, multicultural, happy, you know, integrated, diverse society. That was seen as quite a sort of strength. I mean, obviously, recent events, it does feel that is very much freeing. It does feel like we're more polarised. But what I think that what this book, to me, spoke to a truth about, an uncomfortable truth, is, as much as for a long time we have been, oh yeah, we live in this big kind of rainbow society, actually, behind closed doors, there isn't as much integration as we'd like to all kind of think. Actually, people do sometimes feel quite sort of, if you're, let's say, as I have been many of the times, you know, the only kind of, you know, Asian person around, or person of colour, particularly I was living in Scotland, you do feel quite sort of different. What do you think, what when you were putting this book together, what did you think about where we really are as a society in terms of cohesion and integration?
It's interesting because, funnily enough, I grew up not experiencing much racism at all, but that was partly because I grew up in a very strong Bangladeshi community. The school I went to, I think, was 90% people of colour. So I grew up in Tower Hamlets in East London. And I didn't have a sense that we were, or some people would accuse Britain of being a racist country. And it's only when I grew older that I saw all of these tensions. And I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine, and I said, would you really say that we live in a racist country? And she said, well, if you went into a pub, no, she said, well, if you came across a pub with the St. George's Cross above it, would you go inside? And I said, well, I wouldn't, but I don't think that's a fair reflection on the country. But I think the thing is, so much of it is subtle. There was that study that an Adam had, I think it was 12 times more chance of getting an interview than a Mohammed, for example.
Yes, yeah.
And so there are lots of different structures that are inbuilt. So it's not, you know, somebody seeing somebody and calling them the P word. It's down to the fact that, you know, my name is Kia Abdullah, and I've had conversations with other authors. Abir Mukherjee, funnily enough, who's on the programme, I did an event with him, and he said he considered changing his surname to something more racially ambiguous because he felt that it would be better for book sales. And I remember saying to him, well, don't you think you have a responsibility to the community to show that writers like Abdullah or Mukherjee can sell? And he said, well, my primary responsibility is to my family and to sell books so that I can feed them. And I thought, you know, that was really sad, but I mean, I can't say. I mean, I've sold reasonably well, but I can't say, you know, would somebody pick up a Slater versus an Abdullah? It's tricky.
And do you think things are changing in the world of publishing?
I do, yeah, I do. Publishing and general as well. You know, you talked about people being insular, but, you know, I grew up in an insular society. My mum probably has never had dinner with a white person. And my ex and I were together for 14 years, and 12 years into our relationship, she said, when are you going to get married? And she said, it's okay, people do marry white people, you know? Which was quite funny. But the thing is, growing up, I would never have imagined that she'd be okay with that. And, you know, we got married and she was okay with that. And so she's 76 now, and I'm teaching her English. And so people can change, and people do change, and societies do change. And you know, my niece married a white guy, and it was all fine. Like, we went along to the wedding, and we dressed in traditionally British clothes to assimilate, and they dressed in traditionally Asian clothes. And it was just this moment of like beautiful cross-culture. And so definitely things are changing, and I'm optimistic.
And your book is so... what do you think about kind of classifications of genre? Because reading your book, you know, how would you... Because people... Is it a crime? Is it a thriller? Is it, you know, about community? What do you think about these genres and the labels that have to get put on books?
It's tricky because when I wrote my debut, which also kind of engaged with cultural issues, it was 4 Muslim boys accused of a sexual crime by a white girl. And it was a response to some of the headlines we were seeing at the time around Rochdale and so on. And it could have easily been kind of contemporary fiction or women's fiction. And my editor and I had a conversation about it, and they said, well, we're going to say it's crime. And I remember seeing the cover, which actually as a cover is quite pretty, but it's very genre, you know, big block lettering, a shadowy silhouette, the sort of novel that you might see in an airport. And there's this idea that these novels are disposable. You read it on a plane, and I thought, well, you know, I've crafted this novel through years of hard work, but crime does pay. And so I've come round to thinking that it's quite useful to have labels because the reader understands what that is. And actually, it's quite nice when someone says, well, I was expecting just a very traditional police procedure, and I got all this cultural commentary as well. And it's up to them whether they want to engage with that. First and foremost, I'm attempting to write a page-turner and a thriller, and then the cultural commentary is kind of extra. I
love it. Come for the page turning, stay for the cultural education. I think that's a very, very good. And look, you're very productive. You've got another book coming out in the summer. Just give us a wee sneak preview of that.
Yes, so the next book is called What Happens in the Dark, and it's about 2 childhood friends who've had different trajectories in life. So even though they started in quite a poor background in Tower Hamlets, Lily is now a famous TV presenter, and she suffers a bit of a fall from grace, and she's ended up at a struggling local paper. And one day Lily is seen on TV with bruises, and she claims that it's completely innocent, but then a few days later, the police are called to her house, and a body lies dead at her feet. And Safa begins her own investigation, but she's not prepared for what she will uncover.
Ooh. When's that coming out? Ooh.
That's in June.
That is in June. Okay, well, that sounds like it's and you know, because obviously we're from similar backgrounds. You know, I'm from a place called Assam, which is very close to Bangladesh, and you know, and our family, you know, my family's quite sort of traditional as well. So when I was growing up, it was like, you can be anything you want to be in the world, a doctor, lawyer, an accountant. Of course, I've ended up as a Labour politician and a journalist kind of thing. But what was it like for you when you were like, Mummy, Dad, I want to write about killing people?
Well, I mean, I was saying to Kate, actually, I always wanted to be a journalist when I was younger. But when it came to choosing my degree, I just didn't see any writers, you know. As I said, I grew up in East London. And so actually, my degree's in computer science. And so I worked in tech for 3 years, and then I took a 50% pay cut to go and work for a magazine.
Wow. Well, do you know something, Kia? I think what a brilliant woman you are, and also what a genuine trailblazer, because in our world and in our community, you know, there's lots of brilliant women who are doing things, but I can't think of anybody else doing what you're doing, which is writing, knocking at absolute top drawer, you know, page-turning crime and thriller novels, but also doing it with great integrity. And so let's have a huge round of applause.
Thank you.
For Kia. Right, let's turn to Bee now. So tell us all about One Woman Crime Wave. I just love the title of it so much as well. So good.
Thank you. So One Woman Crime Wave initially took inspiration from a work that probably everybody here knows, and your parents probably know it, and your kids probably know it, by J.B. Priestley and In Spectacles, which I did at school, and it never quite left me. I'm from Yorkshire also, so I have a strong J.B. Priestley bias. But J.B. Priestley, as well as being one of the great playwrights of his era, was also a huge broadcaster, a towering figure of the interwar, of the post-war time, and his writings and his broadcasts, his radio broadcasts, were only second only to audiences got by Winston Churchill.
Wow.
He was a huge figure in that post-war era, and was responsible, his writings and his research and his plays were responsible for in large part for the creation of the welfare state. So it was all very much with a political purpose. And I fell in love with that when I read him at school. And I always wondered what it would be like if that play, which I don't know if you need a reminder, but there's a middle-class family that essentially through their actions bring about the demise of a young working-class woman called Eva Smith. But we never meet Eva Smith. We don't hear her voice. She doesn't really exist in any real sense. And I always wondered what her story would be. And so that kind of was in the background of my mind when I wrote the story of Ashley. And Ashley is a 15-year-old girl. She's very, very clever, and she's very, very angry. If any of you have ever been a teenage girl or lived with them, I've got 3, you'll know that they're a sort of combination of incandescent rage and vulnerability, and it's quite a
Only
force.
to be matched when you hit your menopause again.
Well, yes, then it comes right back. That's so true. And actually, I see these kind of life shift points almost as a superpower. But in Ashley's hands, sadly, that superpower goes a bit wrong. But what's happening is, so Ashley has this sort of addiction to secrets and a compulsion. She is, as you mentioned, she's kind of the neighbourhood's favourite babysitter, A-star student, etc. But what she's doing when they leave and go out to their dinner parties is pretty bad. And she begins to pick through their lives and try to unravel their secrets. And what's happening there really is the sort of slow dawning realisation of the barriers in her life and to her progress by her social status, avoided by her social status. So it's about class. She's from a really disadvantaged background, and the houses that she babysits in are posh houses. It's set in Camden. I mean, we're in Camden right now, and we all know that Camden is famously wealthy and fabulous and full of oligarchs and celebrities, but it also has 40% of its children are living below the poverty line, which is below the London average. And I also saw recently that Camden is at top in the nation for fast food. Yay, go Camden. so it's got some really important indices. And 30% of its children, sorry, I got this the wrong way around. The data is 40% of Camden's children are privately educated, 30% are below the poverty line. Wow. So what you have there is a really unusual mix. And it's on that sort of pinnacle that Ashley can look into both worlds. And it's the sort of dawning of this is what feeds her rage.
And what I love about it is, again, it's very human, because we all love a bit of Through the Keyhole, right? Like we do.
Bit of Peepshow.
We do. We're all voyeurs. We're all dirty little voyeurs, let's be honest. But what is great is kind of Ashley, even though when I'm reading it, I'm like, this is appalling, but I'm like really interested in knowing what's in these. And like she really goes into detail, and people, she really has a good time in the bathroom, doesn't she?
Oh, she loves the bathroom. So I like to do a sort of psychological / creepy experiment with audiences. Come with me if you will. So imagine you go into someone's house, like someone you know, and you go to the toilet. So you go into the bathroom and you lock the door, and you go to the loo, and then you wash your hands, and the mirror is a cupboard. Do you open the cupboard?
Yes.
Okay, show of hands. Who would open the door and have a wee peek? Go on. Oh, yeah. Come on, let's just be... Okay,
right,
be honest.
Keep your hand up if, once you get past the boring shampoo, there's like an interesting kind of box at the back, and you go, shall I just have a peek? Will I open it? Is it medication? You know, I mean, it's awful. I've taken this kind of slightly sordid
Basically, don't invite Bee to your house. That's all we're saying, basically.
Game over. I'm never invited to anyone's dinner party ever again. But yeah, it's sort of taking that sordid curiosity and pushing it to the maximum.
But it's also really interesting, isn't it? Because it's very intimate. So she's trying, because what lies in the bathroom is very intimate on lots of levels. So she's really trying to get under the skin of these people.
Yes. Yes, but she doesn't even realise at this stage that it's partly fuelled by almost a sense of revenge and this dawning sense of injustice, that she realises the lengths to which sharp-elbowed middle-class parents will go to advantage their kids over anyone else's kids. And the realisation that she makes is through being in their houses and witnessing this spectacle up close. I call it the arms race, the middle-class parenting arms race.
And there's lots of other strong women in the book as well. Tell us about the nanny, Samir, and the awful couple, Giles.
Oh, yeah. So the other central characters, there's a sort of the middle-class paragons, if you like, Tara and Giles, and they live in a house with big windows, and they have.
And that's where
trendy
Ashley used to
careers.
live back in the
Yes.
day.
So there's a twist there in that. Yeah. So she's back babysitting in a place that used to be flats and has now been knocked through and made into a bougie house. But then the sort of counterweight to Ashley is another young woman called Samina, who's she's of Iraqi heritage, and she's a young law student, and she's the one that, again, it sort of plays a little bit with some of the microaggressions that you so brilliantly set out in Those People Next Door. She's the one, because she's slightly other, some of these middle-class families don't know quite how to... The suspicion, when Ashley spins out of control, lands on Samina first. And so they're both kind of jettisoned to a certain extent. And, well, it's interesting because, you know, you just talked about genre. And with crime, obviously, there has to always be a tidy solution. And I got quite worried about how to sort of solve the idea of the heroic individual who has to, you know, uncover or do the big reveal, the sort of Miss Marple reveal. And in One Woman Crime Wave, it's actually the two women that solve it together. It's almost a collaboration that solves the situation. So that's a slight twist on the traditional crime. I'm still working out what crime actually means. Hopefully this whole festival will shed some light on it, because it can be so many different things.
Well, an author friend of mine has the theory that every story is a crime story.
Yes.
Well, certainly in politics, it definitely.
Politics. I mean, it's everywhere, fiction and non-fiction, and just, you know, the idea of perhaps an individual against society, for good or for bad, you know, and the idea of justice and injustice is all captured within that.
And this is your first sort of... How did you find it writing and putting it together?
A nightmare. So I've done non-fiction before, which makes so much more sense, because, you know, my background's journalism. So when you're doing non-fiction, you have a clear map of where you're going and you know what the sources are. And it's just easier. You can't suddenly kill someone and then unkill them. It's just easier. So, yeah, fiction really beat me up. I don't know if I have the stomach to do it ever again. Respect to you, proper
Well, I hope you do,
practitioners.
because I think One Woman Crime Wave is brilliant. And like I say, it kind of plays out like a film. I could totally see it. In fact, yours as well. So let's give a big round of applause to Bee for her brilliant debut. And look, we're going to open it up to questions soon, so get thinking. And I'm sure you've got loads of questions you'd like to put to our panelists. But I just wanted to kind of open up for just a quick chat for a few moments between us, particularly some of those points I raised at the beginning about how crime is seen as a genre and how we discuss crime. Kate, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I think it's always in the figure whose point of view the story comes from, and who is the kind of consoling or ordering presence. It's usually in crime fiction, and sometimes in true crime too. It is a detective or a police officer. And I was interested watching Adolescence on TV the other week, how that there are police officers at the beginning, but then not so much. And it makes it into a totally different thing. And in writing about crimes myself, Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, it's in the title, the guiding kind of intelligence or intuition through the story, the person who carries us through is the Scotland Yard detective, who unusually, in a true crime case, has an emotional trajectory as well as a kind of intellectual puzzle-solving thing going on. And it did make me reflect a lot on the role of detectives in enabling us, the figure of the detective, to go close to a crime while also shielding us from it, legitimising our curiosity, saying it's okay to be curious because it's in the interests of justice, and also sort of standing between us and the dead body. Because to some extent, reading about crime is often, it's reading about mortality, it's death, you know, it's grief. And it's some of the most troubling kind of emotions about sort of damaging marriages or childhoods or cruelties. And it can be very useful to have a figure like a detective to guide us through.
Trusted narrator.
A trusted narrator.
In terms of...
Yeah.
They can be a bit over-heroic, though, sometimes. They are this sort of all-seeing authority that, you know, with a swoop of their cape, you know, that it's very alpha male.
Yeah.
And one of the things I just absolutely love about the work that you do is that direct, full frontal challenge to the misogyny that has persisted throughout the genre, and even sort of questioning our complicity in it by calling it Peepshow. I just think it's brilliant. And Hallie Rubenhold, who's on next, is doing the same thing. And I just think that is a really exciting part of the genre and of what's happening in publishing right now.
Yeah, sometimes the thing, it can be a very, when I say it's sort of consoling and helpful, it is also dangerous and sort of fictionalized. You know, it's the detective figure. So it's very interesting to sort of subvert things or twist them round by introducing the other characters who take centre stage or who do the solving and who don't come from there. And in my latest book, the narrative is really sort of led by two writers, but both are very compromised and complicit in the ways they write about the crime. One's a tabloid journalist who gets the scoop on Christie in return for paying for his defence, and the other a sort of ageing crime writer from St John's Wood who's hooked on morphine and absolutely determined to sort of solve the story. So, you know, the fact that the people, I think, you know, the detective hero in fiction is often flawed, and I think it's for a reason, you know, that their authority is always incomplete, and we should remember that. A story can always be told a different way.
And how do you think things are changing? I suppose this is broader, looking at kind of the genre of crime, not just in literature. I think it feels like it is changing, but you know, across crime as a genre, because I still feel that whether we're reporting on it as journalists in the moment, or whether we're, you know, watching stuff on TV, I mean, I hope things would change, but it does feel like we are still in an era we just have an absolute fascination with young, beautiful women getting killed. You know, you look at a lot of the stuff that does really well on streaming, you look at a lot of the stuff which is, and you know, one doesn't want to sound old Mary Whitehouse about this, but I've had so many discussions with campaigners who are, you know, battling in the field of violence against women and girls, and say, you're doing all of this work, and every time there's a terrible, you know, murder with lots of women and girls, everyone's like, gosh, you know, where could this have come from? And then it is glamorized a lot in terms of, I mean, I think when you and I are having, I don't know if anyone has seen a film that Tom Ford did called Nocturnal Animals, which is just, I just found it so shocking to basically fetishize the sort of killing of these. Do you think things are changing from that point of view, Kia, or do you think we have still got this sort of gruesome obsession with a particular? And also, we know in news values, if there's two victims, one is a young, beautiful white woman, other victim, you know, that's the victim that gets all the media focus and attention.
Yeah, it's tricky. As a novelist, you do have to really think hard about the scenes in which the violence happens. And sometimes you can leave that off page, and in most of my novels it does happen off page, but I think it's really easy to have kind of gratuitous detail without emotion, and I think the reverse can be true. You can have emotion without the gratuitous detail, and so by focusing on a victim or what happens to the victim's family and the consequences of that crime, I think you can add real layers to the story, because that's what's going to add the emotion to a novel. And so having a central character, whether they're a detective and increasingly we're seeing kind of podcasters out there investigating crimes, I think putting the focus on the victim and what happens and their background and story can really bring out the emotion. It's tricky though, of course, because in any crime, the criminal is the anomaly, and that's what attracts our gaze. When Wayne Couzens did what he did, we were attracted to his story and who is he, because he was such a monster and he was such an anomaly, whereas the victims are normal in the most general sense. And so I think almost the reader can be forgiven for wanting to focus on the monster, so to speak, because they are the counterpoint to the victim and society and our friends and family as we know them. So yeah, but I do think as novelists we are conscious of that a bit more. After the kind of Jack the Ripper, there was a book recently out which was focusing on his victims rather than... That's
Hallie Rubenhold,
yeah. And so I think authors are thinking more carefully about that. So I do think things are changing.
Yeah. and documentary makers focusing on it. Like there's a very good documentary about the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, which is also, and a dramatisation actually on ITV that focuses on the women. And
you mentioned the Yorkshire. There's a great female journalist, Joan Smith, who has an incredible story of, there were so few women journalists at the time when the Yorkshire Ripper story was being done as well. She turned up to a press conference at, I think, a police station, and there were so few women, they thought she was a prostitute.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, which just is so, because that's so interesting. That's why these stories are also so interesting, because they're a snapshot of the time as well.
And there's a book called Thread of Violence by Mark McConnell, an Irish writer, about a murderer called Malcolm MacArthur. And Mark McConnell takes the decision, this man murdered 2 people in Dublin in the 1980s. He takes the decision not to tell the victims' stories on the grounds that they didn't ask to be part of this story.
Interesting.
So that's a different way of coming at it. That instead of, to say that they would their families want them to be remembered in this book, their lives to be, for this to be the sort of lens through which their eyes were viewed. Yeah. And so he decides not to be interested, not to go into their histories. And that was when I came across that observation, I was like, yeah, there's that too.
Yeah.
That this thing of like bigging up, let's go to the victims, let's make them into real people, let's humanise them. That too can be a kind of intrusion.
And on that note, Bee, I mean, sometimes when we do talk about the victims and we do put flesh on the bone, sometimes we have a sort of view of the kind of deserving victim and the undeserving victim as well. We can sometimes, I think, fetishize the sort of the virtuous victim, and actually it could just be anybody, and it could just be any woman, not exclusively, but in a large amount of the time. Do you think sometimes when we are discussing crime, we often look at it through that lens?
I think the fact that we're having this conversation shows that these views and these traditions are being challenged. So the idea of the journalist showing up and people thinking, people thinking she's a sex worker is just that. I think that would be astonishing if that happened now. So, and I also see the ideas that you've sketched around the news focus and journalism and how we receive crime stories, and ranging all the way to fiction and non-fiction as part of the same cultural landscape that we inhabit. So we're receiving all of this in various different ways. But, the time that you spend reading a book, be it fiction or non-fiction, is a more intimate, it's a slower, it's much more nuanced. There's space for, it's very clever in your book because, the things that we start to think as we proceed through the book turn out to nothing's certain, and it's very, very nuanced, and it takes you on this journey. And I think that's time just so well spent. You're right to sort of point out news as being guilty of sort of crimes against how victims are portrayed, and it's even worse online. But the answer is to buy books, obviously, and that's why we're all here.
Earlier, you've now got as well, it was probably bad enough, with the more traditional media, but now with social media, you have the rise of the TikTok detectives, and there was that terrible case of that woman, Nicola Bulley. You must have remembered it. And as if it wasn't bad enough for her family, then all these hordes of people were turning up, making films, trying to solve the crime. And that, Kate, makes it all more difficult, doesn't it?
Yes, and I was very interested in researching the Rillington Place murders in the observers. Many of them women, and 2/3 of the listeners to true crime podcasts or watchers of true crime documentaries are women. The victims are often women, and it's quite a stretch. So when Christie appeared at the magistrates' court or at the Old Bailey, there were just crowds, many of them women, just trying to get a look at him. And I'm very... people playing detective, people write letters to the Home Office, sort of saying what they think happened. And it's a very strong instinct, that kind of armchair detective thing. And in social media, it can really get back to to the investigation, to the families, and it becomes very problematic. But it's an instinct. It's one I share. You know, to kind of
it's
want
an extension
to know,
of the work that it's absolutely
Yeah.
it comes from the same place, that curiosity, but just pushed a bit too far.
And fear sometimes, because this is a scary thing. The woman's gone missing. You want to regain control of the situation, and you want to kind of exercise your faculty to kind of be in charge. So our curiosity about the violent deaths of other women can seem perverse, but it also can seem very logical.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, look, we now have a wee bit of time for questions. So, put your hands up. And I think, do we have a roving mic? Oh, yes, we do. Lovely. If you just give us your name and your question, we'll try and get through. We've got about half an hour, so we've got lots of time.
Hi, my name's Ayo. My question is this. Lots of people think that, well, I personally think that if you want a good grounding in social policy and social history, read a crime novel. But what do you say to readers who just basically say they just want to be entertained?
Great question. Let's do batches of 2, and then we'll have a gentleman at the front here.
Thank you for a really sharp and sensitive discussion. I wanted to ask each writer...
What's your name?
Nick.
Nick.
I wanted to ask each writer about their welfare and their well-being. How do you shield yourselves from your subject matter?
Oh, that's a
Great
lovely
question. Both great questions. So what about readers who just want to be entertained and well-being? Kia, come to you.
I think that's okay. I think it's okay to just want to be entertained. There are torrential books that are just pure entertainment, and sometimes I want to read a book like that. I do love a deeper layer, though, so whether that's kind of psychological crime, domestic noir, or kind of courtroom dramas, which are more in fitting with what I write. I think I was a natural reader when I was young, and so telling people that they need to be educated in order to read, or there needs to be some sort of higher purpose to reading, maybe can put people off. And so I think it's perfectly okay to just sell something as entertainment. Obviously, if you are then discussing the death or gratuitous rape, for example, of a woman or anybody, then you do need to be a bit more sensitive in how you deal with that and really think about the level of detail and what you're putting on the page and off the page if you are just writing something. But look, I like a good mystery, I like a good whodunit, so yeah, I think that's fine.
Kate, you got thoughts on that?
I mean, I write the kinds of books that would entertain me. You know, I'm not trying to do anything other than entertain. And obviously, what you write may not be for everyone, and people have different tastes. Absolutely fine. I don't think I ever set out to do anything other than that.
So you're not setting out to write a sort of polemic in
No, just to explore, just to sort of work it out. And not to educate, you know, that's the information, the facts in the book are meant to serve the story, and is the kind of story that, I mean, maybe entertains, not to absorb, to engross me, you know, that's what I'm trying to write, what I'd like, the kind of thing I'd like to read, and that's it.
Bee.
Yes, entertainment, absolutely. I don't think we should be shy about that. I expect to be entertained. If I spend £9.99 on a book, I want it to have an absolutely gripping story, whatever the genre, and, you know, drag me all the way to the end. But there obviously should be more than that. And so the craft then is what else you bring, what else you add. But, you know, entertainment for me is the structure and how you make it inevitable so that the person can't stop reading.
And then to Nick's brilliant question about well-being, really, really great question.
I mean, I'm good at compartmentalising, and so I don't think it really does affect me. Maybe some of the research does more. Because I write courtroom dramas, but I'm not a lawyer, I have been to the Old Bailey and followed cases, I've read court transcripts and talked to barristers and solicitors about cases. And so when you're dealing with kind of real-life stories, you know, you do sometimes need to take a step back. That said, sometimes if I'm writing a really emotional scene, if it makes me cry, then I'm like, okay, that's good, because it's going to make the reader cry. And so in terms of just well-being, I travel a lot. I took up boxing 2 years ago while doing research for my next novel, actually, because she's a boxer. And I thought, well, I need to write this realistically. I need to take a couple of boxing lessons. And I went along and I loved it. And now I go about 3 times a week. So that helps.
Do you know, I got asked to try boxing, and I went. In fact, it was sort of around kind of East London. I went to this sort of fancy club.
You should come to mine.
No, I was so embarrassed. So, it was so embarrassing because I do like my food, and I'm always like hungry. And at the beginning of the boxing session, went to the reception, and the woman was like, "Would you like some wraps?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, tuna crunch would be absolutely." And she just looked at me and she was like, "No, fit for your hands for the thing." And I was like, "All right, I don't think me and boxing are going to get on brilliantly." I didn't return, and they didn't ask me back. Kate, how do you look after your well-being?
Well, boxing sounds the way, but it can be. It sort of gets under my skin less than you might think, especially this latest Rillington Place case. It's one of the most disturbing stories I've ever come across, and that's why I wanted to tackle it. It was to kind of, look it full on rather than shy away. And the material is very dark, but if it's all at the service of your story, you're using it in your own way and relaying it, it does feel like a kind of assertion, a kind of power. The thing that disturbed me most was reading the confession that Christie wrote in Brixton Prison when he was awaiting trial for his for the tabloid, the Sunday Pictorial, which was paying for his defence. And the reason it was so disturbing was not because it was so explicit or violent. It wasn't at all. It was so deadened, it was so muted, it was so boring, and I felt kind of suffocated by reading it, so dissociated from real emotion. And
was it just not real?
It was real, but he was just sort of whining on about,
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, but not even, sort of saying, he was accepting that he'd committed the crimes, but then just kind of being peevish about, I hope the police do know I don't drink brandy, I never have, that he was trying to maintain his respectability, and it seemed as if he had no real emotional access to what he'd done and no responsibility.
And did that sort of stuff get under your skin?
That got under my skin, yeah. The sort of an emotional deadness or hollowness of the thing, it made me feel, it kind of infected me in a way that the violence of the acts I could be quite hardened to, I could be quite tough about, but his emotional sort of emptiness over thousands of words was disturbing.
Gosh,
yeah.
I mean, you cannot imagine how. I mean, there was one bit that struck out to me as well, which sort of just, he was quite matter of fact, like the thing he said to his sister the day before he got hanged.
Oh yes.
He just said, like, don't worry, it's all going to be.
I won't notice much. They'll take my glasses off. But, I won't see what happens.
I found that very, just that absolute sort of, complete sort of lack of any kind of emotion was.
But in terms of the how do you protect yourself, Christie is a character in this book, but I was also kind of coexisting as I wrote it with the women he killed, including his wife, who was a very interesting character, the journalist who covered the case, the crime writer, the families of it. You're not like, it wasn't an experience like being in the head of a murderer. It was like a panorama, inhabiting these different people. So you don't closely identify with him any more than any of the others. And that is a protection, that you're not the consciousness you're inhabiting is not singular.
Bee, what do you do about your well-being?
Well, I haven't properly thought about this before, but it's such a great question. And for me, there was a significant change moving from writing non-fiction, where I felt like I had agency and I was in control and I kind of knew what I was doing. Then moving into fiction and having a character of Ashley about whom I felt very strongly, I became quite engulfed with my feelings about her. And the plot requires, you know, certain terrible things to happen to her. And I just was absolutely smitten by this, and it upset me profoundly. And, you know, I still get quite emotional when, you know, if I read sections of her, and, you know, hoping that she'll be okay. So, yeah, I think you should not protect yourself, really, because having a raw nerve is you know, part of being human, and part of connecting. Any form of reporting, be it journalism, fiction or non-fiction, but being fearless about exposing yourself sort of emotionally to other people's experience, even if it does give you a bit of a wobble, is how to inhabit someone else's life, which ultimately is what we're all doing when we read books.
So submit yourself to the
Yeah.
feelings. Right, 2 excellent questions. Let's take another 2. Okay, there's 2 just there together, side by side, which is very convenient. Could you just give us your name and question?
Hello, ladies. My name is Bianca. I'm doing a PhD on crime thriller, so I'll do a feature next year. And my question is about how do you write female-led protagonists in your books compared to men protagonists like detectives, or even a point of view of the victim, or like a family or a friend member. And is there a difference on how to write female protagonists compared to male protagonists?
Okay.
If they were here writing, if they were male, I would have asked the same question.
Great
Thank you.
question.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Paul. I have 2 questions for you. One slightly, the first one longer, second one very short. First one is, so how do you craft the book? So do you start with an idea and then work forwards and plan a plot all the way through? Or do you start with an ending and then try and plan the plot and things that happen all the way back to the beginning, I guess, which is kind of, and where do you get your ideas from? Sorry, trade secrets. And the second one is, are you on Kindle, and do you make any money from that?
Okay, right. Okay, so we've sort of got 3 questions. Well, let's start with Bianca's question about, would you kind of write your female protagonists or characters different to male ones? Bea, I'll start. We'll work our way back.
For me, where are you? Well, there you are. For me, it was totally obvious because I was raised by a single mum and I grew up in the era of Thatcher, so I just thought women ran everything until I suddenly became old and had children and realised that they don't, to my utter horror. So it was very easy for me. It's far more easy for me to have a protagonist who's a woman, because it's also my lived experience. There are men in my writing, and you know, you just put in the research, but it certainly did not present a problem.
Kate.
Well, when writing about historical events, focusing on and trying to use the prism of the woman's experience is nearly always going to throw up something fresh. It's going to give you a different take on everything. So it feels a very fruitful way of getting inside a story, because it's likely to be an angle that it hasn't been looked at from before.
But harder work, no?
Yeah, harder work to find the material, for sure. But it's there, as I said in the archives. There's lots of testimony from women and men about the women in the case. It had just been ignored at the time, and there was also this long 100-page essay about the case by the crime novelist Fryn Tennyson-Jesse, the St John's Wood morphine addict I referred to. And she had investigated it firsthand. She'd interviewed the lawyers, the police, the family of Tim Evans. And so looking at it, reconstructing it through her letters and archives through her eyes was like being able to go back on the ground at the time to have a kind of live view of the unfolding case and investigation. And so there will be these overlooked sources that can give us new ways in. And so it's a very pragmatic, exciting, fun way to approach these old stories. I think to think of people whose eyes you haven't looked at them through.
Yeah, that's such a good point, particularly with, well, I mean, whenever you look at so much of history, whether, you know, it's crime, whether it's political, whatever, it is generally the male story which kind of wins, really, that sort of succeeds. So there's probably so much untapped gold in terms of women's experiences. Kia?
Well, writing from a female perspective has always been really easy. I'm one of 6 sisters, so I come from a very female-heavy family. Writing from a male perspective has actually been quite revelatory for me, because I grew up in a family with very strict gender roles. The girls were expected to learn to cook and clean and stay at home, and my brothers had free roam of anything and anywhere. And so I grew up thinking that they just had very charmed lives. And for my second book, I really had to put my head into a young man's, and that's when I realised that actually men do suffer from strict gender roles as well. I had never seen any of my brothers make a round of tea or change a baby's nappy or wash dishes, and when doing those things maybe compromises your masculinity, what happens when you actually face real difficulty in life? You're not allowed to show any vulnerability. And so I understood then that actually men do struggle with all of this stuff. You know, maybe they don't mind changing a baby's nappy, but it's what the other male relatives in the family will say about you. And that's the kind of family I grew up in. And so it gave me more compassion, I think, towards the men that I grew up with, that I saw had these very charmed lives, but actually couldn't show emotion, couldn't show vulnerability, had very strong ideas of masculinity should be, and that really kind of strangled who they could be as adults. And so, yeah, it really helped me getting into their heads as well.
I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, that's that's a whole separate conversation that we're now having as a result of, you know, adolescence and talking about, you know, I don't even want to say toxic masculinity in itself. It's, you know, where modern masculinity is. I think that's a really good point. Right, let's now address Paul's 2 questions. Well, let's start off, let's do his first question, which is the craft. How do you craft these books? Bea, start with you.
I love hearing what everybody does it differently. I begin with an idea, and then it drags me through the mud and through the hedges and everywhere it wants to go, and I write tons of stuff that doesn't end up in it, so I do it the most messy and least efficient way. And I like to kid myself that all then informs the final product, because your characters have been in so many situations that you kind of know them very deeply. However, it takes me forever. There must be a better way than that. What do you guys do?
I'm very much a plotter, and so my first 3 books I wrote to a very strong plot, and then Those People Next Door actually is the book that I struggled with most, because I thought, well, you know, Stephen King can do it, maybe I can just fly by the seat of my pants, and I can't. I had a beginning and an end, but I just kind of trusted myself to make up the middle. But I really struggled, and partly maybe it was during the pandemic, and so it was my pandemic book, and I'm energized by being out in the world and hearing other people's stories, and so writing in this vacuum was really hard for me. So with book 5, which is the one out in June, I went back to my technique, which is sit down, chapter by chapter, I know roughly what's going to happen. Obviously, scenes change, because otherwise it can become a bit like paint by numbers, but I really do need to know that there's enough story there in order to start.
And when you were sort of struggling with that middle bit, how did you remedy that? Are there other people you can talk to, or do you just have to talk with yourself? How do you sort of get out of that?
Well, before writing this book, I never drank at home. But now I do. I like to blame the pandemic, but I think it was that book. I think just going on lots of walks and, yeah, talking to my partner and working through. And we actually split up last year on good terms, and I emailed him and I was like, if I get stuck with my next novel, can we talk? And he was like, of course, you know, just let me know. And so, yeah, just bouncing ideas off.
So alcohol and talking to somebody, that's pretty good, going for long walks.
Yeah. Yes, for me, it's important not to have a fixed idea or a prejudged idea about how I'm going to tell the story, because I always approach a new subject, project, case as a kind of mystery, as something I want to find out about. So I'm not first of all the teller of the story. I'm the explorer of the story, and I don't want to know what I think until I've gone into all the research. So that's non-fiction, it's maybe different. But eventually, yes, you have to make a plot. It's your spin on it, your way of telling it, that will hit all the things that you think matter and that are emotionally resonant. And you do kind of want to know where you'll land, how it'll end, but don't really know that until you actually get there. The most important thing is where you're going to begin, because that's the point of view you're beginning with, that's the moment in time you're beginning with, that's where the reader's going to sort of move from, and it kind of determines everything that follows. So I will often try out different beginnings, and the one that clicks, that leads most naturally on to the next thing that the reader or I need to know, is the one that starts generating its own momentum. So the beginning will determine, and then the other elements, you keep moving around and trying in different juxtapositions and different, jumps forward and backwards, and that is kind of fun. I like that, playing with structure once you've got started.
Now, let's pick up on Paul's final question. Kindle, are you on it, and are you making any dosh from it?
No and no.
At
At least I don't think so. I try and avoid Amazon like the plague.
No, neither.
I mean, my books are on Kindle, but I mean, the money just gets wrapped up in my royalties.
Yeah, I would just say, please buy real books from real bookshops.
Yeah.
That's
Please buy
very
books from
good.
bookshops. I know that it's very convenient to do otherwise, and there are lots of reasons to have them on screens, but bookshops
Yeah, I mean, what's
are...
interesting is when I moved to Yorkshire, I'm back in London now, but in Yorkshire, I lived in a town called Richmond, Rishi Sunak's constituency, and there was one bookshop there called Castle Hill, and the first time I went in there, I was looking at the book, and my partner said, it's £3 cheap on Amazon. And I said, well, do we want to live
Is that
in
why you split up?
Yes! You're fired.
And I said, well, do you want to live in a town without a bookshop? And he said, no, of course I don't. And I think when you live in a city, that can kind of be masked because there are so many bookshops, but eventually there won't be.
Yeah,
so...
it's very important. Okay, bye. Right, let's take two more. Well, let's go on sort of this. Let's go up to the top, and then we'll come around to this. I want to make sure we've. There's two ladies at the back with their hands up. Yeah, you two. Yeah. And if you give us your name and question.
Hello, hi, thank you. That was fascinating, Iman. Just to go back to the opening remark about the beautiful set, and just wanted to add how it's obviously recreating a very familiar domestic space. Obviously, it's like someone's living room, and we're sitting around having a chat, and how fitting it is that it's about crime and violence. And traditionally,
Where's this going?
crime has been, and the domestic and the home have been linked. And in all of these stories that you've been so brilliantly talking about, the home seems to really feature prominently, whether it's the bodies of women found behind the kitchen wall, or what the neighbors are up to, or looking through the peephole, or whatever it is. And obviously, statistically, we know that the home can be the most dangerous space for women. So yeah, I just wondered about your thoughts around the home and where it sits in terms of your thinking about crime, this kind of jarring sense of the home as a haven, as a space for comfort, but also as a space where danger and crime lurk as well.
Brilliant question. Great observation. Yep. Next lady over there.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I wish my home was as beautiful as that. Is all I'm going to say to that one.
What's your name?
Laura.
Laura.
We've touched on adolescence a couple of times now, and it seems like such a huge cultural moment, in terms of its worldwide viewing figures to explore further. And I was just wondering from the panel who have seen it, their thoughts on the structure of how that story has been conveyed, huge coverage on kind of single shot, et cetera, but also the reflection that, of course, Katie and her family are not included as voices within that story either. Thank you.
Great question. Okay, so let's start with Iman's such a great observation about the home being, a place, a haven, but it can also turn into, a horror story. Kate, let's start with you.
Yes, I'm sure this is a big reason why women are so compelled by true crime podcasts and documentaries, that it's a genre that exposes and reveals the horrors inside the home of women trapped in unhappy marriages, of abused children, of the toll taken, the dangers of the family unit and the privacy of the home. And in The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, which was in a way, the Road Hill house murder was in a way a foundational case for crime fiction, because of this closed room mystery that Agatha Christie stories and much crime fiction is based on, is also the closed house mystery. It's people sort of trapped, trapped or willingly trapped inside this space, and the privacy that shades into secrecy of English domestic life seems to me absolutely at the core of a lot of our fascination with crime fiction, and the darkness that can lurk in this supposedly pure, almost sanctified, safe space. And I think that's why we keep going back to it and want to get inside that home and see what the hell's going on, the dark histories and the damage that's inflicted in those places. And that's in the Rillington Place story. The address became almost more famous than the name of the murderer, 10 Rillington Place. And often these places become symbolic sites of kind of damage and darkness, and the way that houses can seem to be, evil, though of course it's what goes on inside them that creates that.
But there's that sort of eternal tension between the exterior, what we present to the world, and then what's really happening inside, which is obviously delicious as a tension. In One Woman Crime Wave, the idea of the home is very important. And the people whose large fancy houses Ashley babysits in are essentially, their privacy is violated profoundly by her presence, by her coming in and what she does there. But the point of interest for me is the idea that they don't, there's an intense awkwardness around that relationship of staff or people you employ, people that you pay to come into your house and give you a service of some kind. And that, I really I lent into the uncomfortable nature of that, not least because I think class is one of the last taboos in our society. Britain has slowly and perhaps very reluctantly begun conversations around race and around misogyny and sexism. But class is still a sort of taboo area where people feel very attacked and people feel very defensive when they have to reflect on class, and when they perhaps feel that someone's come into their home and is going, those sort of slight tensions, and how that sort of fuels some of the uncomfortableness of my book.
And Roskillia, in your book, the home is the central character.
I think when crime happens in the home, I love I think the shame aspect's really interesting. So I mentioned my next novel, and Lily, this famous presenter, denying that anything is happening to her. And because the home is meant to be a haven, when crime happens there, it's a shameful thing. If I was walking home late one night and a stranger came and punched me, it would be far easier to tell my family and friends that happened than once I went home and my husband did that to me. And so I think that shame aspect brings an extra layer to a story that I find really interesting. And, which is why I chose to interrogate it.
And then let's move on to Laura's brilliant question about adolescence. I will join in on this one as well, because I've been absolutely gripped by it, and I was lucky enough to interview Jack Thorne on my radio show, Times Radio, Culture Hour, 6 till 7, Sunday nights. And it was a really, really interesting conversation, because there's been so much chat about it, and particularly around politics at the moment. We're all talking about it. It was raised at Prime Minister's questions. The Prime Minister said that he was watching it, that he would quite like it to be shown in schools. But I've been having loads of conversations. I'll just give you my perspective, particularly as a parliamentarian, and what's happening in Westminster around this. I think this has thrown up so many interesting questions. And I slightly disagreed with the Prime Minister in the sense that he said, I think this should be shown in every school. I think it was so nuanced in a way. I'm not sure. I think it's brilliant, so this is no shade on it. I don't know if lots of 13-year-old boys would quite understand, because I think a lot of adults didn't quite understand some of the messages. And I have been speaking to a number of people in Westminster, and what's interesting is they thought it was great. However, because it was done in a way that didn't have any easy answers, like all the loose ends were not all tied up at the end. We didn't see him getting sentenced and he confessed as to why he did this and what was going on. It was not entertaining in the sense that it was not a satisfactory sort of ending. And it's interesting that some people, I've had some criticism, particularly from some northern MPs who have been saying, I felt that it was stigmatising working class. I felt slightly stigmatised, like white working class boys. I'm worried that in the context we're in, some young people might not quite get the nuance of it. So that's just to give a bit of grit in the oyster. The general view is that it is absolutely brilliant, but I think it's thrown up some really complicated... The other thing that I was quite shocked about, and sort of doing my research for interviewing Jack on this, and I put this question to him. We're living in such a polarised age that this was clearly a piece of work about misogyny and the things you were talking about, how men view themselves in society. And because we're in such polarised time, my timeline is littered with people from the far right attacking me for interviewing this guy, saying, you didn't raise that, why was it a white boy that did this crime? And I actually put that question to Jack Thorne, and he was like, oh my God, are people now, have we lost our minds so much we're saying that seriously a white child couldn't do it? Why are we turning this into like a culture war about race when this is a culture war about what's happening with... So I think it was such an interesting piece of work, brilliantly done. I think that a lot of people, and Jack Thorne said this to me, he said, look, it is up to everybody to put their own interpretation as to why the child did this. Some people have leapt to a very easy answer saying, oh, I think this is all about not having fathers. I think there's so many different strands in this, and I think what was clever about it is that it wasn't easy. It didn't answer the question for you. It was like such a big provocation. There's no easy answers to this in society. So I think it was brilliant from that point of view, but I'm slightly nervous about just going in and screening it to all kids and thinking, right, job done. What do you think?
I think as a show, it was really masterful, and the way it played with genre. You mentioned the police officers, and normally you would peg the storyline to certain characters and then they disappear and it becomes something else entirely. So from that perspective, I thought it was brilliant. In terms of the subject matter, you know, there's an argument to be made that it's a bit of a moral panic. You know, we had the video nasty scare in the 80s. But actually, in my personal experience, you know, I'm a 42-year-old woman. On TikTok, I see the way it actually affects my perception sometimes. I think it's trying to radicalise me against men at the moment. But I take that on board, and I think, well, actually, if my mind was young and unformed, it would certainly be affecting the way I think. And so I do worry, and I do think it's an important...
No, I do. I feel like I'm getting radicalised into taking collagen as a supplement. That's what as a menopause. Do you know what I mean? Like, how much collagen can you be bombarded with? Kate, very briefly.
Well, your skin looks amazing,
Yeah, very briefly, I thought it was amazing, and I completely agree with you, Ayesha, about how actually open it is as a piece of work, and how different people who I've talked to have been struck by moved and struck and by different things in it, from the mobile phones to the Stephen Graham father's suppressed rage, which I was particularly moved by. And so I think teenage boys might be up to the nuance, but I think if they watch it, they should have to talk about it for several sessions afterwards, because it throws up just about everything, but you could, there shouldn't be any simple answers taken or glib things taken away from it. So if it was like with compulsory conversation after and discussion, you know, led discussion, it could be really interesting what emerged.
I have to say I'm quite a fan of that idea that that men, young men, but just men in particular, go on to have those conversations and do some of the heavy lifting around the conversations around male rage. But I will add that I'm the last person on earth not to have seen adolescence. And I was thinking, shall I try and say something insightful about it? But I will come unstuck, so I haven't seen it. But I'm a fan of, you know, it's about time for men to sort of do some of the heavy lifting around these sort of rage and, you know, the rage and the division, because I feel like, certainly in my circle
Exactly.
Women have been talking about this for a long time.
And also knowing what their place is in a really kind of, particularly on social media. I think you're right. I think young women are subjected to horrific stereotypes which really limit them. I think young men are as well increasingly. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our time. What an absolutely fabulous way to start the day off. Thank you all for coming to the session so early. Thanks for your questions, and thank you for Kate, Lee and Kia. And final thing, do head to the bookshop. It's right outside, and you can get all their wonderful books. Thank you very much.
Aww. Cheers.